August 30th, 1945. The air over Tokyo tasted of cold ash. What had once been streets were now hardened rivers of ruin, brittle crusts of black, punctuated by the skeletal frames of homes where laughter once echoed. In the distance, the imperial palace stood like a ghost, its moats reflecting a sky that held no joy. It had been less than 2 weeks since the voice of Emperor Hirohito, thin and reedy over the radio, had surrendered the nation, and on this day, the first American boots crunched on the capital's scorched earth. For the Japanese people huddled in the shadows, this was supposed to be the beginning of the end, a prelude to humiliation, violence, and horrors they could only imagine. For years, bedtime stories had not been of gentle spirits, but of American devils who would slaughter them without a second thought. Yet as the first jeeps rolled through the smoke-stained air, the sight that greeted them shattered every expectation. There were no horned demons, no conquerors with torches. There were just men, sunburned and sweating in their khaki uniforms, fanning themselves awkwardly with their helmets. Their pockets bulged, crammed with objects that glimmered like treasure, chocolate bars, tins of Spam, packs of chewing gum. The shock began quietly, a ripple in the silence. It was the children who saw it first, barefoot, hollow-eyed, some wearing little more than rags cut from old futons. They watched from alleys where the wind whipped dust into their hair. Their mothers tugged them back, a reflex of terror. Old men muttered under their breath, cursing the disgrace of enemy soldiers marching unchallenged through the heart of their empire. But hunger is a force more powerful than fear, and eyes that had been trained for hatred now studied the Americans' bulging packs with a curiosity that burned brighter than suspicion. One boy, his ribs a sharp cage beneath a thin cotton shirt, dared to whisper to his sister, "Do you think they really eat all that?" The truth was, they had been promised the worst. Since 1937, state-controlled media had relentlessly painted Americans as barbaric beasts, posters depicting them with fangs and knives clenched between their teeth. Mothers had warned their children that capture meant a gruesome death. Even in the war's final, desperate days, rumors spread like a plague. The Americans would poison the wells, enslave entire families, burn every temple to the ground. But what rolled through the city was so devastatingly ordinary. Tired young men, some barely older than the teenagers who watched them, their rifles slung loosely, their faces etched with a kind of awkward wonder at the scale of the devastation they saw. That day, one soldier scribbled in his journal, "Tokyo looks like a moonscape. I thought I'd be hated, maybe killed. Instead, they just stare at us. Kids everywhere. Too many kids, too hungry." Hunger. It was the axis around which this entire encounter turned. By late 1945, daily rations had plummeted below 1,500 calories per person. Rice, the soul of the Japanese meal, was a memory. People scavenged for weeds, acorns, even sawdust to fill the aching void in their stomachs. Children collapsed from weakness in school. Malnutrition stunted an entire generation. Black markets thrived in the shadows, but only for those with connections to trade. For everyone else, each day was a raw negotiation with emptiness, and into this wasteland stumbled moving storehouses of abundance. Then the unthinkable happened. A young American private, his helmet tilted a little too large for his head, stopped his jeep. He didn't bark an order. He didn't seize property. He crouched down and offered a bar of chocolate to a little girl clutching a broken doll. The girl's mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, a lifetime of propaganda dissolving in a single, unbelievable gesture. She had been told these men killed children first. Instead, she watched her daughter take the bar like a sacred relic, sniffing its sweet, unfamiliar scent before daring a small bite. The girl's eyes widened. A flavor like nothing she had ever known exploded on her tongue. A giggle, light and nervous, floated across the silent street. That sound, that single moment, spread like wildfire through whispers. American soldiers were giving food, not stealing it, not hoarding it, but pressing cans and bars into the small, trembling hands of children. Soon, other GIs followed. Powdered milk was ladled into chipped bowls. Gum was unwrapped for eager mouths. Spam was sliced and passed around, even though no one quite knew what to do with it. The suffocating air of dread fractured, replaced by a stunned, electrifying disbelief. Mothers wept in silence, torn between a gratitude that felt like a betrayal and a humiliation that tasted of survival. Fathers turned their faces away, ashamed that their families' lives now depended on the mercy of their conquerors. But the children, those unerring barometers of truth, did not hesitate. They ate. They chewed the strange, sweet gum until it tangled in their hair. They licked melted chocolate from their fingers, their eyes wide with a pleasure they had never known. For them, ideology melted faster than sugar on the tongue. And watching them, the soldiers laughed softly, perhaps relieved to discover that feeding a child was so much simpler than killing a man. In that fragile, shared laughter, something shifted. Of course, this was not a universal scene. In that same broken city, voices of bitterness still echoed. "Shameful," an old man spat as he watched his neighbor's son run past, a Hershey bar clutched in his hand. "We bow to them now, even for a scrap of food." Yet even he could not deny the life that glowed on the child's face. Hunger is a ruthless teacher, and its first lesson is always pragmatism. For the Americans, the act was part instinct, part unspoken policy. Official relief efforts under General MacArthur's command, SCAP, were still months away from full operation. But soldiers carried sea rations and soldiers have eyes. It was easier to hand out a can of Spam than to explain the complexities of military occupation. Easier to win a smile than to manage a wall of silent fear. And perhaps, for men who had spent years becoming instruments of death, it was a way to remind themselves of their own humanity. The civilians didn't know it yet, but this simple exchange would ripple outwards, transforming scattered gifts into formalized food aid, school lunch programs, and a fundamental reshaping of the Japanese diet. But in that moment, nobody thought of policy. They thought only of the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs and of an enemy bending low to feed a child. By dusk, the news had spread through Tokyo's ruins like a ghost. The Americans had not come only with guns, they had come with food. Fear had not vanished, but it had cracked. And through that crack seeped something Japan had not felt in years. Not trust, not yet, but curiosity. As the sun set behind the shattered skyline, an American jeep paused near a small shrine, its roof half caved in. A soldier climbed out, a can of milk powder in his hand. Dozens of children materialized from the shadows, their eyes wide not with terror, but with a new, astonishing expectation. He smiled, a little awkwardly, and held it out. And in that moment, the children began to understand. The taste of chocolate was more than just sweetness. It was the first sign that the world might be different from what they had been told. In the narrow, smoke-choked lanes of Osaka, a small boy named Haruo sat on a step holding a square of Hershey's. He had been taught that Americans were merciless beasts, but the flavor melting on his tongue could not be reconciled with the word enemy. Watching from a doorway, his mother tightened her hands into fists, her heart a battlefield where gratitude warred with shame. That single tension, gratitude and shame, survival and humiliation, was a mirror reflecting the soul of an entire nation. Food became the new front line, a battle for perception. To the starving civilians, the Americans' rations were mythical artifacts, tinned Spam that shone pink and slick, powdered milk sealed like a promise, and chewing gum that confused grandmothers who thought it must be swallowed whole. To the soldiers, these were mundane, disposable items. And in that chasm of meaning, a quiet theater played out on Japan's streets. Soldiers passed out goods with the casualness of men who had always had enough, and civilians received them with the reverence of those who had learned to live with nothing. The contrast was sharpest in the faces of the children. Oral histories tell of one girl, barely 8, who took a piece of gum from a Marine and held it up to the light like a jewel. After she had chewed all the sweetness from it, she carefully tucked the wad behind her ear to preserve it, returning to it later as if it were spun from gold. Whispers of these moments traveled through the rubble, softening the hard edges of propaganda. "They are not monsters," one boy muttered to his sister. "Monsters do not give candy." The numbers behind their desperation were stark. By the end of 1945, Japan was importing less than half the food it had before the war. Calorie intake for civilians had dipped far below subsistence levels. Adults fainted at work. Children's bellies swelled with hunger. While relief shipments under SCAP were beginning to arrive, distribution was a logistical nightmare. In that gap, the sight of a single GI handing out his personal rations carried a symbolic weight far heavier than the food itself. In cities like Yokohama and Nagoya, soup lines began to appear where powdered milk was whisked into steaming bowls, poured into hands cupped around chipped porcelain. Some children gagged at the unfamiliar flavor, yet they drank it down, the warmth filling stomachs long accustomed to the cold ache of emptiness. But acceptance was never simple. Parents stood at a distance, their faces a mask of unease. To take food from the conqueror was to admit utter dependence. One Osaka mother later recalled, "I cried when my son drank the milk. I wanted him to live, but I felt our pride dissolve with every sip." Pride was a fragile currency in those months, and every act of relief was a threat to its value. Starvation, however, forced a brutal choice. A GI interviewed decades later remembered the weight of a boy's eyes as he was handed a can of Spam. "He looked at me like I was giving him the world. Back home, Spam was a joke, but there, it was treasure. I think that's when I realized what we'd done to this country." The irony was a knife's edge. Food mocked as low class in the States had become a symbol of mercy in occupied Japan. Humor, bleak and surprising, found a way to bloom in the ruins. In one Tokyo neighborhood, a grandmother boiled Spam for hours, assuming it was raw pork, only to complain that it dissolved into a salty mush. Another family tried to fry powdered milk into patties, scraping the burnt mess from their pan in bitter disappointment. These small stories reveal the awkward, clumsy merging of two worlds, where each gift was not just nourishment, but a cultural collision. Children's testimonies from those years burn with vivid detail. A boy recalled the shock of tasting real sugar for the first time, his tongue aching from the sudden, overwhelming sweetness. A girl remembered clutching her first candy bar for hours, afraid to eat it, terrified it would vanish too quickly. When she finally took a bite, she said it was like eating light. These were not just treats, they were evidence, proof that the enemy carried something other than firebombs. But the central conflict remained, a question that hung in the air with the dust. How could a nation reconcile these gestures of kindness with the raw wounds of war? Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not yet history. They were living nightmares. The shadows burned into stone walls were a constant reminder of lives extinguished in a flash. Tokyo's ruins still whispered of the March firebombing, when over 100,000 people had died in a single night of fire. To take chocolate from the same hands that had dropped napalm was a cognitive dissonance almost too great to bear. And yet it happened. Every bite contained the contradiction, bitterness and sweetness tangled into one. As days turned to weeks, the gifts continued, steady and unthreatening, until the foundations of distrust began to erode. Children who had once flinched now chased American jeeps, their hands outstretched, waving for candy. The paradox was almost too much to comprehend. In the wreckage of a war that had shattered a world, a square of chocolate became more than food. It became a symbol of survival, a gesture that forced both sides to see each other not as caricatures, but as human beings. The Japanese learned that the enemy had hands that could feed, as well as fists that could strike. The Americans discovered that victory did not end with conquest, but began with the fragile act of helping the defeated live to see another day. But what these families could not yet know was that these small, scattered gifts were only the beginning. Food was about to become an instrument of peace, wielded not on battlefields but in schoolyards and kitchens, destined to reshape a nation's future, one meal at a time. The ruins of Japan were more than physical. They were emotional landscapes, crumbled as thoroughly as the brick and timber of its cities, Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Yokohama, Osaka, all bore scars that could not be swept clean. By the closing months of 1945, nearly 9 million people were homeless, adrift in makeshift shelters of corrugated tin and salvaged boards. Winter bit through walls that weren't there. And into this landscape of devastation rolled the occupying force, its uniforms crisp, its supplies abundant. The contrast was a daily humiliation. General Douglas MacArthur, the towering figure orchestrating the occupation, understood this dynamic perfectly. "Give them food," he wrote in dispatches, knowing that starving people could not be governed. "And we will earn more than obedience. We will earn a chance for peace." His words filtered down into action. American wheat arrived by the ton, warehouses filled with powdered milk. Plans were drawn for school lunch programs to reach millions of children. But the grand numbers only tell half the story. On the ground, the exchanges remained deeply human and agonizingly awkward. A father in Yokohama stood in a soup line where American flour had been baked into rough loaves. He tore off a piece for his son, but when the boy asked, "Will you eat too?" the father just shook his head and smiled. That boy, now an old man, recalled in an oral history, "I realized then my father had not eaten for days." Survival was measured not in calories, but in silent sacrifices. Men who had once marched for the glory of the empire now queued behind their children, bowls in hand. One remembered his unease. "I fought against them in the Pacific. Now I take bread from them. It feels like defeat twice over." A Marine who had survived the hell of Iwo Jima wrote to his wife, "It's the damnedest thing. I thought I'd never look at a Japanese kid without hate. But today I gave a little girl a chocolate bar. She bowed. I don't know what to feel anymore." These acts of feeding became a kind of mutual reconciliation, a chance for soldiers to reclaim the humanity war had scoured from them. The statistics remained staggering. By 1946, over 870,000 tons of food had been imported to Japan through American aid. By 1947, school lunches, first introduced in Tokyo, were reaching millions of children nationwide. Children who had once fainted in class from hunger now lined up for bowls of stew and bread rolls. Food became inseparable from learning, survival entwined with the future. But even as these gestures soothed, they deepened the core contradiction. A survivor of the Tokyo firebombing recalled, "When my daughter ate American bread, I felt both relief and anger. They burned my home, now they feed her. Which is their true face?" This question haunted the adults, who could not forget the fire from the sky, even as they accepted the bread on the ground. The Americans stumbled through cultural gaps, their gifts of Spam and wheat flour feeling alien to a nation raised on rice. Still, hunger made even the strange welcome. And over time, necessity reshaped culture. Wheat was turned into noodles, bread into sandwiches, foods that would eventually become staples of a modern Japanese diet. A young man, a teenager in 1945, captured the paradox perfectly. "At first I hated the bread. I hated that it meant we depended on them, but I also hated the hunger more. Slowly I realized I looked forward to it. That confused me. How can you hate and need the same thing? As the first full winter after the surrender descended, snow blanketing the ruins and sharpening the hunger, the daily encounters between soldier and civilian became a test of whether former enemies could inhabit the same fragile present. In the rubble, a new story was taking root, one where meals replaced weapons and school lunches replaced battlefields. The Japanese were learning to see their conquerors as something more complex than demons, and the Americans were learning that peace could not be enforced by rifles alone. But the most powerful shift was yet to come, one that would turn these scattered gestures into a permanent foundation, transforming not only diets, but imaginations for generations. By 1947, the rhythm of relief had become routine. Ships unloaded sacks of wheat into Japanese ports, and trucks rumbled through shattered streets, delivering goods that were once unimaginable luxuries. For children who had grown up with gnawing hunger, the sound of a ladle striking the bottom of a soup pot in a schoolyard was as comforting as a temple bell. By 1948, 4 million Japanese children were being fed daily through a collaboration of American aid and Japanese organization. Wheat rolls replaced rice balls, and milk was poured steaming hot. At first, teachers had to coax children to eat bread, an alien taste in a rice-centered culture. But hunger proved persuasive. Soon, they were asking for more. Civilians who once avoided eye contact with soldiers began to exchange nods, then cautious laughter. Children followed jeeps, not with fear, but with shouts for candy. A note from a Tokyo boy, written in shaky hiragana, read simply, "Dear soldier, thank you for bread. I will study hard, so I may become strong." The soldier who received it kept it in his wallet for the rest of his life. This was the story neither side had expected. Americans had braced for guerrilla resistance. The Japanese had braced for enslavement. What emerged instead was a strange, awkward compassion shared across the rubble. It did not erase the trauma of the firebombings or the atomic shadows on the walls, but it added a new chapter, one where the enemy was not only a destroyer, but also a provider. That contradiction became the seed of a fragile trust. The children were already changing. They laughed as they blew bubbles with American gum. They sang songs while clutching loaves of bread. For them, America was no longer just fire from the sky. It was also chocolate in the palm of their hand. The larger transformation was ideological. Food was the occupation's most persuasive weapon, offered with open hands. Nutrition allowed schools to function. Schools allowed democratic ideas to circulate. A woman from Nagoya recalled, "When my son brought home a piece of bread from school, I held it as if it were treasure. It was foreign, strange, and yet it was life. I thought then that maybe we would not vanish." Another from Hiroshima described the impossible irony. "The same America that had destroyed my city gave my daughter milk. She drank it every day. She grew tall. I could not forgive, but I could not deny the truth of that milk." Decades later, veterans of the occupation spoke not of combat, but of children's faces. One recalled, "I still see their faces when we gave them soup. They bowed so politely even though they were starving, broke me more than any battle ever did." By the early 1950s, as Japan began its astonishing economic revival, the memories of hunger receded but never vanished. The children of the occupation, now adults, carried with them the unshakable image of American soldiers handing out food in ruined streets. The story of Japan and America after the war is not one of simple triumph or defeat. It is a story of paradox, where kindness sprouted from violence. It is a story of how children, unburdened by pride, became the first ambassadors of reconciliation. They tasted the food of their conquerors and discovered not demons, but men. And perhaps that is why the memory endures so powerfully. It reminds us that even in the darkest aftermath, small acts can shift the course of nations. A spoon of milk, a square of chocolate, a piece of bread. These were not just calories. They were quiet proofs that compassion can take root in the most unlikely soil. It is remembered not as humiliation, but as the strange, tender beginning of something no one had dared to expect. For sometimes the most lasting victories are not won with fire or steel, but with kindness, measured one spoonful at a time.